I'm 71 now, though sometimes when I catch myself in the mirror, I see the boy I once was. Wide-eyed, restless, leaning too close to the old wooden radio in my parents' living room. That's where it began, really. Not in the theater, not with the baton, but with that box of humming tubes glowing warm on the mantel. Beethoven, Mozart, Verdi, voices and strings that seemed to pour through the static like a secret language only I could hear. This morning, my grandchildren handed me an envelope, creased at the edges from their little fingers. Inside was a ticket to the opera. Not New York, not Chicago, but the small civic opera house in our own town, the very place I once commanded an orchestra pit, back when my hair was still black and my shoulders could carry the weight of so many dreams. I stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity. The name of the theater was printed in bold, but what I saw were memories. The dim chandeliers swaying slightly in the draft, the velvet seats rubbed bare in patches by decades of townsfolk, the faint smell of wax polish and perfume. I remembered the silence that fell over the hall before I raised my hand, before the downbeat summoned 100 instruments to breed as one. And suddenly, the years between then and now folded in on themselves. I was no longer a grandfather in a cardigan with shaky hands. I was 20 again, full of fire, certain that music could change a man's life, maybe even the world's. That ticket was more than a gift. It was a key that unlocked the doors to every hallway of my past. My childhood, my schooling, the friends I made and lost, the loves I found, the nights I nearly gave it all up, and the mornings when I chose to stay. But it all began, as most stories do, with a boy who didn't yet know who he was. Only that music lived inside him like breath. I was born in a small Midwestern town in the early 50s, when America was still stretching its arms after the war, trying to figure out what it wanted to be. My father worked in a factory that made farm equipment. His hands were calloused, his back bent early. My mother, she had a voice like honey, though she never sang on a stage. She hummed when she cooked, sang softly when she mended clothes. I think it was her voice, more than the old radio, that planted music deep in my bones. We didn't have much, just a 2-bedroom house with peeling paint and a porch that leaned, but we had Sunday dinners, the smell of roast beef filling the kitchen, and evenings when the family gathered around that radio. I'd close my eyes and imagine I was inside those great halls in Vienna or Milan. At school, I didn't quite fit in. Other boys wanted to play baseball, chase girls, or tinker with cars. I tried. God knows I tried. But when the band director put a baton in my hand for the first time, something clicked. It wasn't about leading, not really. It was about listening. Listening so deeply that you could feel where the music wanted to go before the notes even left the instruments. I practiced like a madman. I studied scores until the ink smudged on my fingers. Mozart, Brahms, Gershwin, those pages became my closest friends. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd wave my arms in the dark, conducting symphonies only I could hear. My father thought it was strange. "Son, you can't put food on the table waving your hands in the air." But my mother, she just smiled. She said, "Let him follow the music. The world will always need beauty." She was right, though I didn't know it then. Still, those were tender years. The smell of chalk and ink in the classroom, the sting of rejection when kids laughed at me for choosing music over football, the rush of pride when my band director tapped my shoulder and said, "You have something, kid. Don't waste it." I didn't know it yet. But that was the first step on a road that would lead me to the podium of a small-town opera house, standing before dozens of musicians, hearts pounding in unison. But before all that, I had to leave the safety of childhood and walk straight into the fire of growing up. Leaving childhood behind was like stepping off a cliff into a fog. I graduated high school in 1970 when the world outside felt like it was unraveling. Vietnam was on every news broadcast, protests shook the campuses, and the music, Lord, the music was changing everything. Dylan, Hendrix, The Doors. It was rebellion, it was fire, it was the pulse of a restless nation. But even then, my soul clung to the timeless sound of orchestras, to the discipline of strings and brass weaving together. I enrolled in a state university. Nothing fancy, but it had a solid music program. I still remember the smell of the rehearsal halls, dust, varnish, and the faint tang of brass polish. The pianos were always slightly out of tune, the air heavy with chalk from blackboards filled with musical notation. I lived for it. While my roommates spent their nights in smoky bars, I was buried in the library, bent over scores that stretched like labyrinths across the page. Those years were not easy. Money was tight. I worked evenings washing dishes at a diner just to afford sheet music and secondhand dress shirts for recitals. My fingers were cracked from soap and hot water, but the moment I picked up a baton in practice, it all fell away. I could feel something larger than myself moving through me. There were friendships, too. One in particular, a fellow student named Robert. He was a violinist, quick with jokes, always with a cigarette dangling from his lips. We were an odd pair. Him, reckless and charming, me, shy and obsessive. But we became inseparable. He dragged me out of my shell, taught me how to laugh when the pressure of exams and juries nearly broke me. We'd stay up late, two scrappy kids in cheap dorm chairs, arguing about Mahler versus Beethoven, about whether American composers could ever rival the Europeans. And then there was Anna. She was a soprano, 2 years ahead of me. She had auburn hair that caught the light like fire, and when she sang, it felt as if the world stilled to listen. I was terrified of her at first, of her talent, her confidence. But she noticed me one afternoon as I stood alone in a practice room, waving my arms like a fool to an empty stage. She opened the door and laughed. "You look like you're conjuring ghosts." And just like that, she became part of my story.
College gave me music, yes, but it also gave me love, companionship, and the first taste of what it meant to live for something more than myself. Yet with all the sweetness, there were shadows. The weight of the draft lottery hung over us, and friends vanished to war, some never returning. It was a strange, uncertain time to be young in America. And while the world raged and shifted outside, I clung to the steady rhythm of a baton slicing through air, dreaming of the day I'd stand before an orchestra of my own. Would you like me to carry part 4 into his first break into a real theater, the moment he steps out of student halls into the professional world? The first time I set foot in a real opera house, I felt like a trespasser in some holy place. It wasn't even New York or Chicago, just a modest theater in our little city, built in the 1920s, with velvet seats worn smooth by decades of patrons, and chandeliers that flickered like ghosts from another era. The carpet smelled of dust and perfume long faded, and backstage was a maze of ropes and pulleys and dim corridors painted in flaking green. I wasn't a conductor yet, not by a long shot. I was 24, fresh out of school and lucky enough to land a job as an assistant, part gopher, part translator of the maestro's chaotic notes, part glorified page-turner. My pay was miserable, but I didn't care. To stand in that space, to feel the air charged with anticipation before a curtain rose, was everything I had dreamed of. The orchestra pit was my sanctuary. I loved the smell of resin and brass oil, the hushed chatter of musicians tuning before rehearsal, violins squeaking their scales, trumpets testing their lips, the low rumble of a bassoon like a secret grumble from under the floorboards. It was chaos, but to me it was the heartbeat of creation. The maestro, an older Italian named Signor Belanti, was both terrifying and inspiring. He barked in broken English, waving his arms like a storm wind, veins bulging at his temples. He could reduce a flautist to tears with a single glare, yet when the music came together under his command, it was like the air itself split open with beauty. I studied him the way a soldier studies a general. Every flick of his wrist, every narrowing of his eyes, I stored it away, quietly building my own language of movement. It was also in that theater that Anna reappeared in my life. She had graduated, gone on to sing small roles with regional companies, and now here she was, rehearsing as a chorus soprano. Seeing her again was like a jolt to the heart. She carried herself with more poise than ever before, but she still laughed the same way, head tilted back, eyes sparkling, as if she couldn't hold joy inside. We shared stolen lunches in the cracked courtyard behind the theater, our sandwiches balanced on sheet music, talking about dreams we were both half afraid to say aloud. Not everything was idyllic. I saw jealousy flare between singers, friendships strained by ambition, marriages cracked under the strain of endless rehearsals and travel. I saw musicians drink themselves numb after performances, unable to handle the crash after the high of applause. The theater was a world of passion, yes, but passion often carries its own brand of cruelty. And yet, night after night, when the curtain lifted and the first swell of the overture rose up, I knew I was where I belonged. I wasn't ready to lead, not yet, but I was learning, breathing in every detail, biding my time. It was there, in that worn little opera house, that I began to understand. Conducting wasn't just about keeping time. It was about becoming the vessel through which dozens of souls could channel their artistry into one heartbeat. I didn't know when my moment would come, but I knew, as I watched the maestro's baton flash in the half-light of the pit, that someday it would be me standing there, holding all that chaos together with nothing more than a flick of the wrist and the weight of belief. I remember the night as if it happened only yesterday, though nearly half a century has slipped by since then. It was not supposed to be my turn. I was still the assistant, still the young man who sharpened pencils, arranged sheet music, whispered cues to sleepy horn players, but life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. That evening, we were scheduled to perform La Traviata. The house was packed. Ladies in their best dresses, men in pressed suits, the smell of perfume mingling with the faint mustiness of the old velvet drapes. I could feel the weight of expectation buzzing through the air, like static before a storm. But Maestro Belanti, he collapsed. Not in the dramatic way you see in films, but quietly, just minutes before the overture. A hand pressed to his chest, his face pale, his breath shallow. He was carried to the side, and suddenly the musicians turned their eyes towards me. I can still feel the way my knees trembled, the way my throat tightened. The theater manager whispered in my ear, "You know the score. You've studied every bar. You must take the podium." For a moment, I wanted to run. I was 25. What if I failed? What if I ruined not just the music, but the reputation of the entire company? My hands were clammy, my vision blurred from panic. But then, I remembered every hour I had spent watching the maestro, every gesture etched into my mind, every correction he had barked at me. I remembered Anna waiting backstage in her chorus costume, her eyes wide with fear for me, and yet a small nod of encouragement. So, I stepped onto the podium. The hush that fell over the pit was deafening. I lifted the baton with shaking fingers, my heart hammering so hard I feared the violinists could hear it. And then I gave the downbeat. The strings began tentative at first, then stronger as my confidence found its footing. The music rose, swelled, wrapped around me. My arms moved almost without thought, guiding, shaping, coaxing. Suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was alive, more alive than I had ever been. The singers followed, their voices soaring, weaving through the orchestra's fabric. Every cue, every swell, every silence. I felt it deep in my bones. By the second act, I forgot the audience even existed. It was just me and the music, the players, the singers, the pulse of Verdi's masterpiece flowing through us all like a shared heartbeat. When the final curtain fell, there was silence for a breath, and then an eruption. Applause, cheers, the kind of raw, grateful sound that shakes the walls. I lowered my baton, my body trembling, sweat running down my back, and in that instant I knew my life had changed forever. Afterward, as I stumbled off stage, Anna found me. She didn't say a word, just threw her arms around me and whispered, "I knew you could." And for the first time, I believed it too. That was the night I became a conductor. Not by title, not by contract, but in my soul. It didn't happen overnight, though people like to tell the story as if it did. One triumphant night, and suddenly I was the new shining conductor. That's how the local paper painted it. Young assistant steps into the spotlight. I kept that clipping folded in my wallet for years until it was worn and soft at the edges. But the truth? The weeks and months that followed were a mixture of glory and humiliation. Yes, I had tasted success, but one night doesn't make a maestro. I still had so much to learn. I stumbled. Oh, how I stumbled. I would come in too early, cue a section too late, or let the brass overpower the delicate strings. The musicians, seasoned veterans twice my age, would raise their eyebrows, exchange smirks, and in those moments I felt like a boy playing dress-up. But here's what saved me. I listened. I swallowed my pride and I listened. After rehearsal, I'd sit with the concertmaster, Mr. Levin, a wiry man with silver hair and sharp eyes. He'd pour himself a glass of cheap whiskey, light a cigarette, and go over my mistakes note by note. "You rushed the andante. You didn't give the bassoons enough air. Don't wave your arms like you're swatting flies. Show us what you want." It was brutal, but I cherished it. That was how I learned. And then there was the theater itself. Our opera house wasn't grand like the ones in New York or Chicago. It was modest, worn, with velvet seats that smelled faintly of dust and cologne. The chandeliers flickered when the wind outside rattled the old windows. The paint backstage was chipped, the corridors narrow, always buzzing with singers warming their voices or stagehands swearing under their breath as they pushed sets into place. But to me, it was magic. Every corner held a secret. Every creak of the floorboards sang of history. I spent more hours there than I did at home. I'd arrive before the janitors finished sweeping and leave long after the last soprano's laughter had faded into the night. I was consumed, driven by a fire that felt almost holy.
At home, Anna sometimes sighed, setting my plate down cold when I stumbled in past midnight. "You're married to the music," she would say, half teasing, half weary. And she wasn't wrong. Still, she stood by me. Even when the money was thin, even when the rent was late, she believed in the boy from a small town who dared to lead an orchestra. Those years were full of contradictions. Applause that lifted me into the heavens, and failures that left me in tears behind closed doors. Friendships forged in the pit, rivalries born of egos too big for our little city. I learned that music wasn't just about notes on a page. It was about trust. Trust between the conductor and the musicians, between the stage and the audience, between a man and the life he chose. And slowly, with each performance, I began to build something more than a reputation. I began to build an identity. Not just a boy with a baton, but a conductor, a voice in the great conversation of music. The first real taste of momentum came with Puccini. La Bohème, to be exact. I still remember the dress rehearsal. Our soprano's voice soaring over the orchestra, the cellos swelling like a river under her. By the final act, when Mimi dies in that small attic room, I felt the entire theater inhale as one body and then hold its breath. It was in that silence, that unbearable silence, that I realized we had created something larger than ourselves. The reviews were kind. The audience grew. For the first time, the theater filled not just with the old patrons in fur coats, but with young couples, families, even college students clutching cheap tickets. The opera house was alive, and God help me, I was at the center of it. But success has a price. At home, Anna grew tired of eating dinner alone. Our first child, Michael, was born that same year, and though I was there in the hospital, I wasn't there in the weeks that followed. I told myself I was providing, that the applause and the extra performances meant I was building a future for him. But the truth, I was hiding in the music, too intoxicated by its pull to notice the little hands reaching for me at home. I missed his first steps. I missed his first word. Anna told me about them after the fact, her voice quiet, her smile tired. "He's growing fast," she would say. And though her words were kind, there was an edge beneath them, a quiet warning I pretended not to hear. The theater became both my sanctuary and my sin. I loved the chaos backstage, the smell of hot lights, the rustle of costumes, the clatter of sets being hauled into place. I loved the rehearsals, even when they dragged into the night, the musicians joking and cursing in equal measure, the singers demanding just one more run. I loved standing on that podium, the baton in my hand, feeling the orchestra respond like a living organism to the smallest flick of my wrist. But as my reputation grew, so did the distance at home. My children, Michael, then later my daughter, Claire, learned early to wave goodbye to a father who was always rushing out the door with scores tucked under his arm.
The community adored me. They called me maestro, even at the grocery store. Elderly women would stop me to say, "Thank you for bringing life back to the opera house." I smiled, shook their hands, and went home to a kitchen where Anna's eyes asked me silently if it was all worth it. And yet, despite the tension, despite the guilt, when the downbeat came, when the music filled the hall, I felt whole. It was a selfish wholeness, perhaps, but it was mine. Success is a strange beast.
It feeds you, lifts you, makes you believe you are untouchable, and then, quietly, it begins to eat away at you from the inside. By the late 1980s, our little opera house had become something of a miracle. We were drawing crowds from neighboring towns, even a few critics from Chicago. National magazines wrote small features about our hidden gem. I was invited to guest conduct in bigger cities, Cleveland, St. Louis, even once in New York. For a boy who had grown up with only a battered piano in the living room, it was intoxicating. But temptations followed, as they always do when applause grows louder. There were singers, young, brilliant, fiery, who looked at me with admiration that wasn't only about the music. There were invitations to late-night dinners after rehearsals, glasses of wine that turned into confessions, laughter that lingered too long. I told myself it was harmless, that Anna didn't need to know, that a little flirtation was the tax one paid for being a man in a world of art and passion. But the truth was more complicated. I crossed lines, blurred them, justified them under the excuse of artistic temperament. The betrayal wasn't always physical. It was emotional, too. Sharing secrets with someone backstage that I should have been sharing with Anna. Allowing another woman's laughter to echo in my head on the walk home. Each small act a crack in the foundation of the marriage I had promised to protect. And then there was the professional betrayal. A younger conductor, fresh from Juilliard, was hired by the board to assist me. He had charm, ambition, and a certain arrogance that rubbed me raw. I saw the way he courted the donors, the way he whispered to the board members, as if planting seeds for the future. My future. At first, I laughed it off, but late at night, when I couldn't sleep, the fear gnawed at me. What if I was already becoming obsolete? That fear was louder than any aria, louder than applause. It followed me everywhere. And still, I poured myself into the music. When I raised my baton, all of it, guilt, doubt, betrayal, fell silent, at least for a few hours. The orchestra was still mine, responsive to every gesture, every breath. But even as I stood before them, I sometimes wondered how long before someone else took my place. At home, Anna's patience thinned. She never accused me directly, but there were moments when she caught a whiff of perfume on my jacket or when I stumbled in past midnight smelling of Chianti, when her eyes told me she knew. And though she stayed, though she cooked my meals and kissed our children goodnight, there was a distance between us that no music could fill. I often ask myself, did I love the music more than I loved her, or did I simply not know how to love both at once? The breaking point came quietly, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. It was the early 1990s, and the Opera House was preparing for its most ambitious production yet, La Traviata. Donors had opened their wallets wide. The local newspaper was calling it our town's cultural milestone, and expectations were higher than ever. I threw myself into rehearsals with a manic energy, as if sheer effort could drown out the voices in my head, voices of doubt, guilt, and exhaustion. The night of the premiere, everything seemed perfect. The strings shimmered, the sopranos soared, the audience leaned forward in rapt attention. I raised my baton for the final act, feeling that old familiar surge of control, of destiny in my hands. And then it happened. My vision blurred.
My right hand trembled. The baton slipped, clattering to the floor like a gunshot in the hush of the theater. The orchestra faltered. The singers looked at me in panic. For the first time in my life, I froze. A conductor who could not conduct. Somehow, the assistant, yes, that ambitious young man I had resented, leapt forward, steadied the orchestra, and carried them to the finale. The audience roared with applause, but I stood there humiliated, clutching the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing. The doctor's words the next day were clinical, detached. Stress, exhaustion, possibly a mild stroke. Nothing fatal, he assured me, but his eyes warned me just the same. Your body is not a machine. At home, Anna said little, but her silence was heavier than any reprimand. I knew she had seen me falter, not just as a conductor, but as a husband, a father, a man. My children, nearly grown now, looked at me differently now, not the untouchable maestro, but a human being with cracks in his armor. For weeks, I couldn't pick up a baton. My hand shook too much, my confidence more so. Nights were the worst. I lay awake listening to the creaks of our old house, wondering if the whispers were true, if the younger conductor was already rehearsing behind my back, if the board was quietly preparing for my retirement. But the cruelest thought of all was this. What if I had already lived my best moment? What if the music would go on, but without me? It was then that I first tasted fear, not of death, but of irrelevance. Recovery was slower than I wanted, and humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated.
I spent weeks at home, my baton untouched, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. The music still existed, but it felt distant, a world I could no longer reach with the same certainty. Anna brought me tea, my children stopped by, trying to be cheerful, but the atmosphere was thick with tension, with the unspoken fear that the life I'd built might slip away while I slept. I began physical therapy first, then exercises to regain my hands' precision. The doctors were patient, reminding me that my body had limits, reminding me that my mind could only compensate so much. And while I appreciated their logic, it was maddening. I was a man who had spent decades commanding a room, commanding the air itself, and suddenly I couldn't control the simple flick of my wrist. It was in those quiet mornings, alone with a cup of coffee and the first weak sunlight of autumn, that I realized something crucial. I hadn't lost the music, I had just lost my arrogance. I began to understand that being a conductor wasn't just about leading, it was about listening, about patience, about humility. Slowly, I returned to the podium, not for full performances at first, but small rehearsals, solos, chamber ensembles. Every tremor of my hand was a reminder of my mortality, every faltering note a lesson in resilience. My orchestra, once skeptical, watched me rebuild myself, and I felt their support, their unspoken loyalty. They didn't expect perfection, they expected honesty. At home, I mended old gaps too. I attended my children's games and recitals, listened longer, held hands without thinking of the next rehearsal. Anna and I spoke more openly, the silences less sharp, her presence a tether to a life outside the theater. I began to see that music and love weren't enemies, they were parallel currents, and I had ignored one for too long. By the end of that year, I conducted a full performance of Carmen, not flawlessly, my hands still betrayed me at moments, but with a depth I had never known before. The audience noticed it too. They cheered not just for the music, but for the man who had returned, a little older, a little wiser, but more alive than ever. It was a lesson I would carry forward. Strength is not measured by control alone, but by the courage to reclaim what you fear you have lost. The following years were a delicate dance between mastery and moderation. I was no longer the reckless young conductor who threw himself into every note as if the world depended on it. Experience had taught me to savor, to breathe, to let the music carry both me and the audience, rather than trying to force it. Our opera house thrived. Audiences returned season after season, loyal patrons who had grown with us, and new ones who marveled at the intimacy of a small city theater that still produced magic. I mentored younger conductors, sharing the lessons that had nearly cost me everything, lessons in patience, humility, and the delicate balance between ambition and life itself. Watching them stumble and rise reminded me of my own journey, and I took a quiet pride in guiding them without the ego that had once consumed me. Home life, too, had found a rhythm. Michael was in college by now, Claire entering high school, and Anna and I had discovered the beauty of ordinary evenings. Dinner together, laughter spilling over, and quiet walks when the theater was empty. The shadows of the past remained, but they no longer dictated our days. I could smile without guilt. I could rest without fear. And yet there were moments, the faint echo of applause in my dreams, a page of music left open on my desk, a soft note of a violin that reminded me how deeply intertwined my identity was with the orchestra. I had lived through fear, triumph, mistakes, and near loss, and all of it had shaped me into the conductor I had become. I began to plan my eventual retirement quietly, knowing that the time would come to step away from the podium. I wanted it to be graceful, a passing of the torch, rather than a sudden fall. And though the thought was bittersweet, I felt a sense of readiness I had never experienced in my younger, reckless years. By this point, I understood something vital. The value of a life is not measured solely in applause or accolades, but in the depth of the relationships we nurture, the patience we cultivate, and the music, literal or metaphorical, that we leave behind in others. And so, each rehearsal, each performance, each quiet evening at home became a meditation, a gentle preparation for the day when I would lay down my baton for the last time, content in the knowledge that I had lived fully, loved deeply, and conducted not just music, but a life worth remembering. The day I retired arrived with a quiet inevitability. I had planned it for months, writing letters to my orchestra, speaking with the board, arranging a final performance that would honor the years we had spent together. And yet, when it came, the weight of it pressed down on me in ways I hadn't imagined. The final rehearsal was surreal. Every note, every pause, every breath felt amplified, as if the walls of the theater themselves were bearing witness to the end of an era. The young conductors I had mentored stood in the wings, their eyes filled with both admiration and sadness, and I realized that I was passing on not just a role, but a legacy. Anna sat in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene. Michael and Claire, now young adults, had traveled back for the occasion, their presence a reminder of the life I had almost neglected in my pursuit of perfection. Seeing them there, smiling and proud, struck a chord deeper than any overture I had ever conducted. The performance itself was flawless, not because I demanded perfection, but because the orchestra understood me without words. Every crescendo, every diminuendo, every lingering silence was a conversation we had shared over decades. The final note lingered in the air. The audience held their breath and then erupted into applause that felt like an ending and a benediction. I took my final bow with tears I refused to hide, not for loss, but for gratitude. Gratitude for the music, for the theater, for my family, for the long, twisting path that had brought me to this moment. I had loved and lost, stumbled and risen, erred and forgiven, and through it all, I had conducted not just music, but a life worth remembering.
Later, when the theater emptied and the echoes of applause faded into memory, I walked home slowly, feeling the crisp autumn air against my face. I paused at the corner, looked back at the glowing marquee, and whispered a silent thanks for every note I had ever raised. I knew that my story, like the music I had led, would continue in others, in the young musicians I had guided, in the audiences who remembered, in the love I had nurtured at home. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. In the weeks after retirement, I found a new rhythm, a slower, quieter life, yet no less rich. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, sunlight spilling over the neighborhood streets, the distant hum of life carrying a comfort that no theater could match. The baton lay untouched on my desk, a silent companion to the memories it had helped create. I walked often through the park, where I had once paused to watch families and children play, and now lingered to savor the seasons, to listen to bird song, to feel the wind through my hair. I found joy in small things, the aroma of fresh bread at the bakery, the laughter of grandchildren playing tag, the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. Life, I realized, had always been music. It just wasn't always scored. I wrote letters to old colleagues, sharing thoughts, memories, and gratitude. Some replied with warmth, others with brief acknowledgments, but all reminded me of the invisible threads that bound my life to theirs. I visited the orchestra occasionally, not as a conductor, but as a friend and mentor, content to watch the young take the stage with passion and talent, knowing I had played my part in their growth. Anna and I took long walks, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes in comfortable silence. The cracks in our relationship had healed, leaving behind a deep understanding that had once seemed impossible. Our children thrived, carrying pieces of our love and lessons into their own lives, and I felt a quiet pride in their independence. And often, when the house was still and the world outside softened into night, I would sit by the piano in the corner and play. Not for audiences, not for accolades, but for myself. Each note a conversation with the past, a tribute to the life I had lived, a reassurance that the music, in some form, never truly ends. I understood finally that happiness wasn't about perfection or triumph or applause. It was about presence, connection, and the courage to embrace both the light and the shadows of one's journey. The last days of my life as a conductor were not marked by fanfare, but by a quiet, profound sense of completion. I had survived the storms of ambition, the turbulence of mistakes, the bitter tang of regret, and the fleeting sweetness of triumph. And now I could sit back and simply be. A man who had loved, erred, and created beauty in ways both grand and subtle. I often walk past the opera house, now empty in the stillness of the afternoon. The marquee glows faintly, a memory of nights filled with music and applause. I pause, close my eyes, and let the echoes of decades wash over me, the vibrations of strings, the resonance of voices, the sigh of the orchestra hall breathing beneath the chandeliers. It all belongs to me, and yet it belongs to everyone who is shared in it. At home, Anna and I sit by the fire, sometimes in conversation, often in comfortable silence. Our children visit, bringing laughter and stories of lives we nurtured but did not control. My grandchildren tug at my coat, asking questions about music, about life, about the world I knew. I answer as best I can, knowing that in my stories, in my music, in the patience I finally learned, I leave something enduring behind. I reflect on the choices, the flirtations, the fears, the failures, and the triumphs. I see now that every note, every decision, every misstep shaped the man I am. I am grateful, not for perfection, but for the fullness, the texture, the unpredictable, messy beauty of life. And in the quiet moments when the house sleeps and the wind whispers against the windows, I feel it, a deep, abiding joy, a life lived fully with passion and love, with mistakes and redemption, with music in my hands and heart. I smile not with arrogance, but with peace. I am 71 years old, a retired conductor of a small-town opera, and I am profoundly, completely happy that this was my life. The music never truly ends. It lingers, like a heartbeat, like a memory, like the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived.